Hello and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Monday, December 30th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it is great, as always, to be with you. My gosh, I can't believe that we only have 48 hours until the new year and 22 days until the inauguration of President Donald Trump. By the way, I've announced here that Salem is actually hosting a special to award two listeners the ability to go to the inauguration with flights paid for, hotels paid for, and 2 tickets to see a historic event occur. So you can go to snc.tv for more information on that, and definitely, at the very least, enter into that sweepstakes, because you never know. You could be there in the cold in 22 days watching Donald Trump become the 47th president. Now, speaking of Donald Trump's inauguration, this past election I viewed as a referendum on the modern day Democratic Party. We saw so many people coming out of the woodwork saying that even if they didn't love Donald Trump, or we often hear they don't appreciate his character, even if they had some hesitations about Donald Trump, they were so disgusted with the state of the left in the United States that they had to go and vote for MAGA. There is a book that exposes the Democratic Party all the way back to its origins 2 centuries ago. And what you will find is that the more things seem to change, the more they stay the same. And that is certainly true with the history of the Democratic Party. I am so pleased today to welcome the author of that book, Daniel Greenfield. He is here in studio with us. The book I am holding up right now, it is called Domestic Enemies: The Founding Fathers' Fight Against the Left. Mr. Greenfield, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
I remember you were here a few months ago. You were on Dennis's show, and he was a big fan of the book. And when you walked in, everybody in the producer's dungeon was saying, "Oh, hi, it's good to have you back." So thank you.
Oh.
Now, I was looking at the table of contents of this book, and the first chapter, if I can flip to it quickly here, has a description that sounds all too familiar. Now, the dates are from 1793 to 1800, but here's the description: how America's first community organizer used a pandemic to build the democratic urban political machine and steal an election. Sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it?
It certainly does. I was writing this back in 2020, and there was just a sense of despair for a lot of people that America had fundamentally changed, that there was this major breach and that we were in an unrecognizable country. And the message I wanted to send was that we as Americans had always faced these problems. We had always faced these challenges. And you started by talking about the Democratic Party. Well, a lot of people have nostalgia for the Democratic Party. They think, this was not my father's Democratic Party. This was not the Democratic Party I was part of 30 years ago. And we've just had Carter pass away, and there have been all these nostalgic memories of Carter. Well, he wasn't so bad. Well, yes, actually, he was so bad. We're dealing with the crises that he created. But we tend to the party of FDR, the party of Woodrow Wilson was not so bad. It became bad at some point. It became worse, yes. But the Democratic Party were always fundamentally a leftist party, even before that was their official name. And in this book, I wanted to trace all of that back to really show that, yes, this is what the Democratic Party had been from the beginning, but also that we can overcome this because we've been dealing with this fight for 2 centuries, over 2 centuries, and we're still here.
You just issued a powerful statement there that the Democratic Party has always been a leftist party. Now, my co-host and dear friend Dennis Prager often draws the distinction between liberals and leftists. He often says, I don't have much problems with liberals except for the fact that they vote for leftists. The real issue I have in America is with the leftists. Now, you contend, as I just said, and as you just said, that the Democratic Party has always been leftist. What's the evidence for that?
Well, many of the founding fathers were certainly liberal. What they were not generally was leftist. We did have some leftists in the past. And the dividing line, certainly back then, and I would argue today, is government authority. To the left, it wasn't enough simply for people to change how they lived. There were leftists who wanted to do that. Back then, they set up their own communes, which I also discuss in the book. They would abolish private property, marriage, other institutions within that commune. But increasingly, leftists wanted to do what they did with the French Revolution, which was to violently change the regime and then actually use government authority to change how people lived by force. The French Revolution was one of the more surreal periods in human history because it was not just a revolution about removing a king, which is what people think, or about removing a hierarchy. They actually created a year zero. They created their own calendar. They forced everyone to adopt a similar dialect. They at one point abolished religion in general, and they created the cult of the supreme being, complete with pagan rituals. And this is something we tend to see with the left. People think the left is going to have this stopping point or that stopping point. We're going to have gay marriage, and that's going to be it. Or we're going to have X amount of socialism and not Y amount of socialism. But the left's objective is this year zero, one that is going to be enforced by governmental authority. And in this election, actually, a lot of people took a look at this year zero. They took a look at cities that are unlivable, at their children's education that is trying to transform their children into something fundamentally different. They said, we do not want to live like this. But this has really been the conflict with the left from the very beginning.
Let's go back a few centuries, because I think of the leftist Democratic Party as emerging really in the past 50 to 100 years. Mm-hmm. And I can understand how they are the kind of ideological heirs of the ideas of the French Revolution. But as I said, let's go back a little earlier, because when you think of the founding of America in the first century of our country, you think of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and then the Democratic Republicans, and then there were the Democrats and the Republicans, but you don't tend to think of any of them as falling into what we would now deem as the category of leftism. Is that wrong?
So leftism is an interesting term. You know, the left, there's been some debate about what to call ourselves as conservatives, but the left constantly keeps changing names. Remember, woke used to be a thing? Now the only people using woke are probably going to be on Salem, because the left no longer wants to call itself woke.
Sorry, I just looked over at Sean, who was cracking up. Go on.
Yeah. The conservatives now call them woke. So the left no longer wants to identify as woke. That's a very bad brand. For that matter, we actually have an article in Political that have Democrats that want to call themselves Democrats anymore. They want to call themselves independents. You know, they've gone through various terms: progressives, socialists. They're liberals. And then Rush Limbaugh, among others, made the term liberal so toxic they didn't want to call themselves liberals.
I'm sorry, who made the term?
Rush Limbaugh, among others, made the term liberals so toxic they didn't want to use that term anymore. The point is they constantly are changing their names. And why are they doing that? Because their brand is very bad. It's very toxic. It's very unpopular. So they've constantly been transforming themselves.
Right.
And the other idea behind that is that they have no past. It's always this young grassroots movement that pops up out of nowhere that has a new vision. There's no past to it. It's always a new generation. In fact, of course, it is a very old movement, and they don't actually want to address that. So when we look at American history, yes, we look at Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but that was largely a more structural debate, as opposed to the debate about what America would actually look like. Would it be a country where you would actually have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Or would it be a country that would have this perfect government? So one of the differences between the French Declaration of Independence and the American one was that the French created the idea of the universal right of happiness. You would have a universal right to happiness. But what if my happiness is different than your happiness? Well, the government is going to decide what everybody's happiness should look like. And that was the French Revolution in a nutshell. As opposed to the American Revolution, you're going to pursue your own happiness. You're going to find your own happiness for yourself.
So again, help me understand where the leftists in America emerged and who they were in the beginning.
So this was a European movement. Like much else, this came from America. America was the receiving end of this. But there were people who increasingly believed that you needed a new system. And the American Revolution obviously set up a new system, but they wanted a much more profound transformation of the system. Because the American system basically said, we're not going to have remote central authority, we're going to have local authority, and we are going to actually give people the ability to make decisions for themselves, but we're not going to fundamentally transform how they live. And the left, really the central idea of the left is that it's not just about transforming government, it's about transforming how people live, it's about transforming society. That's why they talk about social justice, for example. It's not enough just to change who the president is. It's how to change the family, which is one of the things that I discuss in the book, actually. They attack the family early on. They describe abolishing the institution of marriage entirely. They describe the beginnings of the public education system, which was actually going to be taking children from their parents beginning from the ages of 2 or 4, raising them in an institution that would enforce equality. And then, of course, once they left the institution with no parental intervention, they would be perfectly equal. And this kind of vision sums up the left in a nutshell. You have to transform people, whereas the American Revolution focused on transforming the system, the government itself.
I find the family focus to be very interesting. And in fact, about a year ago, I think, I did an episode here on Timeless about the myth of the party swap. I at least learned in high school that after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, many racist people were so incensed by the Democratic Party's support of the Civil Rights Act that they switched to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was the racist party. And I did a whole show actually debunking that and showing, first of all, it's such an asinine idea that over this one thing they would just go, hey, want to switch? 1, 2, 3, let's do it. But also the platform of the Republican Party really has been quite consistent over time. And one such example, it's not just with regard to race issues. We know the Republican Party, of course, was the party of Lincoln, the party that fought against slavery, but also with regard to family issues. In 1856, these are my notes from that show, the first Republican Party platform was adopted at their first national convention, and they promised to, quote, defeat those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. So that points to both of those issues, the family issues and the race issues. And it's fascinating that in 1856, they were already coming out against polygamy.
They were indeed. And speaking of race, actually, the 1800 election, which I discuss in the book, black voters actually were backing the Federalists. They were not backing the Democratic Republicans. And black people tended to vote Federalist for the existence of the party. And black people were part of what was called the Washington Benevolent Societies, which were organizations for black voters that would actually be tied to the Federalists, tied to conservatives, because yes, for a lot of black voters, there was the concern about slavery, but there was also a concern about the Constitution. What the Federalists really offered was this allegiance to the Constitution, one that would protect people's rights in every state. And certainly for black voters, having a Constitution that would protect people in every state was a major area of concern.
So I'm still intrigued by that opening chapter about the pandemic and stealing an election. Tell us about that. What happened?
So back then, the pandemic of the day was yellow fever. It was absolutely catastrophic. The United States Capitol back then is in Philadelphia, which is a mistake they'll never make again, because apart from the crime and violence in Philadelphia of the day, the yellow fever hits. Everybody evacuates. George Washington has to go back to his home. Hamilton actually gets taken sick. Jefferson is on the road. He's looking for a place to stay. The only place is an inn that's renting out places on the floor. So if you can picture, the United States government is in complete disarray. Everybody is on the run. New York is under quarantine. Henry Knox, who's the Secretary of Defense, is barred from entering New York because of the quarantine, and he's joking about trying to smuggle himself inside. George Washington is being asked about various questions of federal governments, and he says, basically, I don't have my papers with me. So the United States government was much more ad hoc compared to today, when it's tens of thousands of people. Back then, it was small enough to fit into a kitchen, which was the original idea. Anyway, people are absolutely panicked. They're engaging, in some cases, in violence against people they don't know. They're refusing them food. They're refusing to give them drink. And this is a perfect time for somebody to come in with a solution. The guy who comes in with that solution is a guy named Aaron Burr. Today, most of you remember Burr as being the guy who killed Hamilton.
That's right, Hamilton.
Yeah, we remember from the musical. Actually, he was a brilliant figure. He was very innovative. He created what really is the infrastructure of the modern Democratic Party. Because back then, elections were much more old-fashioned, and he took a look at that and he said, first of all, we need to actually know exactly who's voting. We need to, instead of appealing to existing voters, we need to create new voters. And he actually uses the yellow fever pandemic to make that happen. What he does is he presents a bill, and that bill was going to fix the problem with the yellow fever by creating a new company that will bring in clean, fresh water. It does nothing of the kind. What he actually does is uses that to, it's one of those bills that you have to read to find out what's in it. And it turns out that the bill creates a bank. The bank eventually becomes Citibank. Fun fact, yeah. What the bank actually does is enables him to buy political support and put a lot more voters on the ballot, because back then in New York, you had to be a property owner. Suddenly, there are a whole lot of new property owners who owe their allegiance to Aaron Burr. Beyond that, he uses an organization called Tammany Hall, which is the really the core of American organized crime. It's the original mafia in the United States. He uses them to fundamentally influence the election. He also does voter outreach, voter turnout. He's the first one to actually do outreach to immigrants in foreign languages. Back then, that's usually German. And he transforms how elections are won, and that's for the first time. This is the first contested presidential election. Jefferson wins, but he actually has a plan to rig the Electoral College, because back then you couldn't actually tell who was the nominee, which part of the president, the vice president, which part of the ticket was the nominee. He actually has a plan to get rid of Jefferson and make himself the president, and by throwing the election into Congress. That ultimately fails. Both sides make a deal. They cut Aaron Burr out of it entirely, and he becomes a traitor and travels the world offering to help them subvert the United States. So, and this is the guy who really creates the modern Democratic Party. He figures out exactly how even modern elections are really run. He uses data to figure out who the voters are. He finds new ways to add voters to the roll and uses a pandemic to do it.
You said that he traveled the world trying to subvert America. Where did he travel, and who did he appeal to?
Well, he eventually gets put on trial for treason. He's planning to create his own empire in Mexico. As I said, this was a very, very busy guy. But there are notes from both the English and French government officials where he's offering them the opportunity to break off parts of New England and basically fracture the United States. Neither side actually takes him up on it, but he is a very, very busy guy.
Wow, I didn't know any of that. Now, you also talk about, in the same time frame, how fake news and the first globalist plot against America created the Democratic Party. Is that what you're referring to with Aaron Burr?
In part, even post Aaron Burr. So it's important to remember, where does the Democratic Party come from? Yes, they're originally the Democratic Republicans, but Democrat is a radical term at the time. It's associated with extremists. It's associated with the French Revolution. And indeed, that's where the Democrat name even comes from. The French Revolution sends various of its agents to the United States. They're unhappy with the Washington administration. They're actually trying to subvert George Washington to remove him from office, because Washington refuses to side between the French and the English in their war. He says the United States is going to remain neutral. And the French Revolution and its political allies in the United States, including a guy named George Logan, after whom the Logan Act has to be named after because of his sympathies for France, they want to remove George Washington from power. Then Adams comes in. They really want to remove Adams. And they have a variety of ways of doing that. So the French Revolution actually sends an initial emissary whose job is to build an infrastructure of political support for France. And they do that by creating organizations known as democratic societies.
What are those?
So these were organizations set up in major cities that would actually rally support for the French Revolution. They were known, and that name is eventually given to the Democratic Republican Party. The Republican part of that is more moderate. The Democrat part of that is more extremist. So it's literally French agents who named the Democratic Party. And the idea of the Democratic Party is you're going to have enforced egalitarianism, again, equity. You're going to remove any kind of distinctions between people. Of course, you're going to have to confiscate some wealth to do it. Then you're going to redistribute the wealth, and everyone will be equal.
It's amazing. I had no idea that the Democratic Party had these deep origins with the French Revolution. Wow. So let's talk about the advent of communism. Of course, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels came along shortly after. Well, maybe not shortly after, but in the scope of history, shortly after the French Revolution, publishing the Communist Manifesto in 1848. How did that contribute to the rise and the platform of the Democratic Party?
So remember I said that they're using different names. Communism, Marxism are different names, but they're basically names for similar things. Early on, after the French Revolution, a guy named Fourier, who's one of the really influential socialists, comes up with the idea of everybody actually living in these communal phalanxes of thousands of people or more. We're going to eliminate private property, you're also going to eliminate marriage, and create this ideal perfect society. Of course, none of that works out. They try setting up communes, and those communes fail. But increasingly, this becomes the default model. They realize it's not going to work individually. These communes are not going to work. But if you create all of society as a commune, then potentially it could work. And 1848 is a key year in Germany because those are the periods of the revolutions.
Yeah.
Exactly. So initially they try for a revolution in France. The French Revolution ultimately falls apart. It becomes a horrifying nightmare that most people are just very happy to leave behind. It becomes an orgy of bloodshed. They try elsewhere. They do try in Italy. And then they try in Germany. And the German revolutions are really important beyond Marx, is that there is now a flood of these. Each revolution results in a flood of refugees coming to America. So the refugees from the French Revolution tend to be more aristocratic. The refugees from the German revolutions, because they failed, tend to be more radical. And these people actually set the template for a lot of the radicalism that then follows in America, because they actually play a role in the Civil War. There are a number of them that are involved in the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off topic here.
Hey, I love it. I'm a history major. I enjoy this.
This is very much a history book. Some of them actually get jobs in Washington, D.C. They get jobs in the administration, and they lay out what becomes a big vision for America coming in and rescuing Europe and actually invading and spreading democracy to Europe. This becomes really the epicenter of globalism. Instead of actually staking their bets on France, because France failed, German revolutions failed, America would actually become the savior of Europe and would come in and actually save Europe from monarchy and from all the oppressive systems. This, by the way, is an explanation for a really baffling giant statue that stands in New York, the Statue of Liberty. People associate with immigration, it has nothing to do with immigration. A basic question Americans sometimes ask themselves looking at that: why did France send us the statue of a giant woman? What was behind that idea? Well, it was really initiated by French liberals, French leftists, people like Hugo, who really liked the idea of America coming in and liberating Europe. So even back then, this was an idea that was being entertained.
Wow. So today, the Democratic Party appears to me to be in such a rancid state of extremism that really doesn't have much of a precedent. Am I wrong about that? Is there more of a precedent than I may think? I mean, obviously, to some extent there is because of the origins that we're talking about. But if you go back to the 50s or the 60s Democratic Party, really was not anything like it is today. It seems pretty moderate compared to what it is today. Was it moderate just on its face, but deep inside it was actually quite extreme? Or did it go through an actual period of being moderate and then now in recent history it's become more extreme?
Well, it wasn't quite as crazy, in part because, for example, the transgender movement only dates back to
80s.
Really kind of the 60s. They began doing some experiments early on, but it was so fringe, and the results were horrifyingly disastrous, leading to suicides.
And if I may, forgive me for interrupting you, but it's so important to know, Susan Stryker, who was one of the founders of queer theory, I talked about this on Timeless, she wrote an essay about transgenderism, and she is a transgender individual herself, and she literally wrote, this person's words, not mine, that the transgender body is a technological destruction or construction used as a weapon against traditional American and familial values. It's a weapon against the Western ideas of heteronormativity. Yeah. That's what she said, So go on.
Yeah, but these are the origins of sexuality studies, which start by trying to deconstruct normative family traditions and values. That said, so really a lot of the origins of some of the craziness was very much there, was just not in people's faces quite as much. But certainly by the 70s, increasingly, it is out there. The larger agenda of, for example, treating criminals as the victims and empowering criminals, very much there in the 60s already. You actually have major Supreme Court cases that start coming down the pike that create a lot of the insane pro-crime system that's today. It's also the origins of the mass shooter, serial killers. These become kind of objects of fascination. The Texas Tower Sniper is really the first major mass shooter that gains popularity, and with that comes social theories, the idea that the criminal is really a victim of society, that he's not actually acting on his own, but he's just, he's had a bad childhood, society is fundamentally unfair, and there are groups that actually spend all their time defending criminals, but it's not really seen as the identity of the Democratic Party, though to some degree it is, and as the Democrats become more radical, somebody like Nixon is able to gain traction using that, and by the time you get to the 80s and Reagan is making that argument fully, especially as people see the craziness that's happening in California campuses.
Let's assess, in the wake, of course, of Jimmy Carter's death yesterday, may he rest in peace, let us assess his presidency. To what degree would you characterize his presidency as a leftist presidency?
Certainly on foreign policy, it was very much a leftist presidency, but even on domestic policy, in many ways, it's really a close echo of the Biden administration. The Biden administration, some said, is the second coming of Obama, but it's also the second coming of Carter. Yes, there was this economic malaise and misery, which was being used at the same time to engage in a transformation of the American economy. Now, people have said that Biden, Carter, Obama, that the economic issues under their administrations were just because they're incompetent, they're not good enough, they're weak, that they didn't do a good enough job on the economy. In reality, they did have an economic program. Certainly the people behind them had one. And the economic program was to shift away from free enterprise toward government control and to create enough economic misery that the ordinary person, in theory, would even welcome that and want government intervention. In reality, the results were disastrous. But going back to well before the 60s, then FDR and the New Deal, they took a depression and they used that as a justification for a government intervention in the economy that is completely unprecedented. The kind of thing that the Biden administration was only flirting with, like price controls, they had fully integrated price controls during the New Deal. So, in a way, we have instead of increasing radicalism in the Democratic Party, we kind of have an up and down. So during the New Deal, you did have a major down as far as radicalism goes, and the Democrats somewhat course-corrected. They decided that this was too extreme, and then they kind of began getting back to it again under Carter. The JFK administration was much less extreme as far as the domestic economy went. The Carter administration, however, definitely pursued all sorts of government interventions in the economy, and the Biden administration was doing all that stuff on a much larger scale with the larger idea of making Americans dependent on the government and actually putting the government in charge of every element of the economy, including the cost of products in stores.
You're talking about this ebb and flow of the Democratic Party, kind of oscillating between radicalism and then taking a few steps down on that. You also mentioned course correcting, which I find to be interesting. And I wonder if in the wake of this second Trump victory, the Democratic Party today is willing to and capable of course correcting. What do you think? Do you think that they're going to have a hard look in the mirror and go, okay, we went too far on some of these policies and the American people are communicating that to us? Or do you think that this party is so infiltrated by diehard Marxists and radicals that they're not going to relinquish any of their positions?
Well, the Democrats are definitely debating what went wrong and how they need to change. They agree there needs to be a course correction, but the various factions are fighting over how that course correction should play out. There are the leftists, there are the more moderate Democrats, and everybody in between. So one of the diagnoses was that they went too far into identity politics, and the identity politics failed because actually minority voters did not stick with them. So one of the course corrections has been to emphasize class more. The Democrats became an identity politics party over their old class warfare focus. Now they're in theory refocusing on class warfare. And one of the symptoms of that is the praise for Luigi, the United Health assassin.
Luigi Mangione.
Yes, they're thinking that maybe this kind of thing is actually the wave of the future. We're going to focus on being as anti-corporate as we can and regain some of those working class votes. It's not the only approach that they're doing, but it's one of the things we're seeing play out.
You're right that they really have moved away from the class angle. That actually has been pretty much adopted by the Republican Party, ironically. I want to talk to you in our final few minutes about Obama. He is a figure who has always captured my attention because when I was 8 years old, when he was running for president, and obviously I didn't know the first thing about politics, he just struck me as a moderate, straight and narrow guy. Watching old clips of him, he does not seem to me at all like a leftist. I would argue his first term was pretty moderate, at least compared to his second term and to Biden's term. But then after 2012, that's when we saw more of the DEI infiltration. We saw obviously him sort of siding more with this burgeoning in popularity belief that the police were systemically racist and that America was systemically racist. What do you make of Obama and his about face?
Well, to understand the rise of Obama, you have to look back at Bill Clinton and the JFK. JFK was really the guy who transforms the Democratic Party. They see in him as the vision for selling a progressive message without appearing weak or soft or anti-American.
How did he do that? How did JFK transform the Democratic Party?
So one of the messages that JFK created was just by being young, by being hip. It was the new generation of the Democratic Party. The other was that he made sure that he was going to always talk tough on foreign policy. This was a major concern for the Democrats, who had just lost China and were still reeling from that. But beyond that, JFK wrapped the message of progressive politics in Americanism. The FDR administration had made the mistake of actually having a radical New Deal policy that was not really wrapped in this kind of patriotic legacy. JFK made sure that it would always harken back to America's founding, and that's something you see early on in Obama's speeches. He's constantly referencing American history and American tradition, and that the result is that made it look modern, made it actually look patriotic. But if you actually look at what he was doing on the ground, the results were often very different. It was actually about pitting different groups of Americans against each other. He very famously said, there's not a black America or white America, there's the United States of America. Those were beautiful words, and they were pretty much the opposite of what he actually implemented. And this is another area where liberals differ from leftists. The liberal idea was that we were going to unite Americans. The leftist idea is whether it's class or race or anything else, we're going to pit different groups against each other. We're going to make one group feel like the loser and the other group feel like the winner. We're going to make America into a zero-sum game. And the longer that Obama remained in office, the more he pushed this zero-sum game, and the more obvious it became. By the time you actually had Black Lives Matter riots, of course, it was pretty out there in the open. But the initial Obama, the phase one Obama, the Obama who talked about bringing Americans together, quickly gave way to the Obama who understood, particularly once the midterms arrived, that his strength actually lay in dividing Americans. And that's unfortunately been true of the Democratic Party throughout its history. Its strength lies in dividing Americans, not in uniting them.
Now, you really come out swinging in this book, and you've come out swinging in this interview, which I admire and appreciate. Did you get pushback when you published the book?
No, absolutely. His history tends to be the preserve of historians who are on the left, and they're not very happy to actually have anyone introduce other notes, even though throughout the book I actually cited chapter and verse many historians who are actually liberal, along with original sources. But they like the idea of having a monopoly on American history. And as we've seen with things like the 1619 Project, what they do with that monopoly is increasingly tear down America. My goal with this book was to show that this is a debate we've been having all along. It's part of the fabric of our nation's history, and we need to understand where the left comes from in order to be able to intelligently discuss it.
One of the jobs of a political opposition is to oppose people politically. Mm-hmm. I am in favor of a democracy, which means I'm in favor of a political opposition. What do you imagine if you were designing a Democratic Party that was progressive but not radical? What would you imagine that they, as a political opposition to the Republicans, would look like in a more ideal future?
Well, whether you call it a Democratic Party or anything else, there should be, I think, 3 points that any major political party in the United States should adhere to. One is obviously supporting the United States above all else. If you support any other nation or movement or outside ideology over the United States, you're not truly loyal to the United States. Which means also you should want the best for the United States, you should want it to triumph, and you should view it actually as the greatest nation in the world. I remember famously Obama saying, well, each nation is exceptional, each people think they're exceptional, which is really not American exceptionalism. So I think American exceptionalism, American allegiance would be the basic concepts there. Beyond that, you should actually believe that the Constitution, as it fundamentally is, should be the governing document of our country. Whatever else you want to introduce, you should introduce those things, but you should not introduce those in a way that conflicts with the founding document. And finally, third of all, and this is something that was a big issue in this administration, you should not try to rig the system in a way that will completely disempower any political opposition. Here in California, we see the virtues of a one-party state. And the Democrats wanted to make Puerto Rico and DC states. They wanted to pack the Supreme Court. They wanted to implement various measures that would create a single-party state going forward that would operate within a set of regulations, but would make any kind of Republican or conservative political opposition completely unviable. And if you do that, whether you're Republicans or Democrats, you're fundamentally a totalitarian movement, and one that is based on disenfranchising half the country.
I mean, agreed to that. That all sounds accurate to me. Thank you so much for coming on to the show today. And as a reminder, Mr. Greenfield's book is Domestic Sorry, there we go. Domestic enemies. The founding fathers fight against the left. And before I leave you, I want to tell you quickly about MyPillow. Who hasn't been wondering all this time about MyPillow? They are still excited to announce their ever-continuing Christmas extravaganza. I bet that their Christmas extravaganza extends to January 1st, 2025. You can get their famous My Slippers, regularly priced at $119.98, but for a limited time, only $59.98. Their 6-piece towel set is also back in stock with extremely limited quantities, only $29.98. And they have bathrobes, duvets, quilts, down comforters, and so much more. You can go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and be sure to use the promo code Hartman to save on all MyPillow products. As mentioned, you can get the flannel sheets for as low as $59.98, 6-piece towel sets for just $29.98, and that's not all. They're extending their 60-day money-back guarantee until March 1st, 2025. Plus, all orders over $75 ship absolutely free. Go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Hartman. And as a final reminder, you can go to Washington, D.C. if you enter into this prize that Salem is hosting, including free airfare and hotels and tickets for you to attend the inauguration. My gosh, if I weren't a host, I would be all over that. You can go to snc.tv or you can text Trump to 94878. That's text Trump to 94878. And then, of course, you can scan that QR code right there on your screen. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll see you soon. Take care.